His teeth would then spread wide across his face. On his days off, we would go into the forest behind our house to hunt for mushrooms. Hugo always expressed excitement over the possibility of finding inedible mushrooms as he led me through the woods. I became engrossed in studying which mushrooms were safe to eat, regardless of whether they were safe or not. One day, Hugo pulled me along with his meaty fingers pressed deeply into my skin, his excitement palpable through the smoke and alcohol emanating from him. As I struggled to keep up, my shoes became filled with dirt. Mycology was Hugo's most recent hobby, acquired from an old friend, he said. However, his interests often shifted from one gruesome hobby to another, from taxidermy to collecting dead things in jars. Though these activities may be harmless in some people's hands, they turned sinister in his. A field mouse captured in our backyard was less a friend and more an exercise in how long he could extend its suffering and how well he could preserve those moments of despair. He would drive a needle into it, capturing the moment in frame-by-frame photographs, and pinpoint the exact moment of the smallest of details. Measuring them in the span of flesh stretched to its limit, twisted in abject horror. It was a different kind of science, one that I likened to a kind of dark magic, powerful and detrimental to its user and the people around him. Wrapped up like something beautiful and awful, sequined and glittering, but dripping in oil-slick, rainbow sheets of sludge. Hugo yanked me forward, his grip turning tighter, causing me to trip as he laughed and continued to drag me over roots and rocks until we reached a clearing with a solitary tree at its center. A small swath of bark was missing from the trunk, leaving it smooth even from a distance. As we approached, I saw a ring of mushrooms at the base of the tree, spiraling up its trunk. Hugo plucked one from the bark and left marks on my wrist, which contrasted against the pale white of freshly pulled bark. It reminded me of his angry red gums, gnashing at me with both smiles and frowns. Hugo was smiling at me, pulling roughly and swiftly, tearing off just as much bark as he did mushrooms, raining clumps of brown to join the clutter of the forest floor. Bark and mushrooms fell haphazardly atop a corpse, a fox, carpeted in what appeared to be more mushrooms. The mushrooms bisected its torso, and the mound of fungi, which looked nothing like what I had seen in Hugo's many books, draped over its body like a dress. Only its feet were left uncovered, but they were not bare. Frost had started its seasonal creep, transforming the fox's paws into glass slippers. Winter's supine approach had begun, starting with her. I hadn't realized it when we first arrived. This was a birthplace, a death anchoring itself to the forest. As I continued to stare at the fox, her lifeless eyes glittered at me in the dying light. Resurrected under my attention, her life found unraveled, unspun at my feet, thread loose, and fibers imbued with story. I imagined that she smiled at me with sharp, friendly teeth for the briefest of moments, and I felt the whisper of her touch, her paw caressing my cheek, and telling me how this fate had befallen her. He gazed at me with hunger in his eyes, as though they were open maws. His basket brimmed with mushrooms, and he moved towards me with them dangling from his elbow. I did not flinch, having been through such experiences before. However, a single oyster mushroom slipped from the basket, landing at his feet. He crouched down, picked it up, and angrily brushed off the dirt. As he cooed over it, I couldn't help but feel he looked vulnerable, having just violently torn it from its home. A rock rested beside the fox's head, with a sharp, jagged edge that could have caused a painful and messy death. The longer I stared at the fox, the more human-like she appeared, smiling at me with her dead eyes. I wondered whether she would still be alive if she had the strength to lift the rock, or if her paws would be frozen. My hands instinctively reached for the rock as I pondered these questions, inching closer to Hugo. I examined his receding hairline, nascent liver spots, and silver hairs. When our eyes met, I raised the rock over my head, and he looked at me with piercing blue eyes. Death whispered to me that it would never get the leaves and mushrooms out of my hair. She sat by my shoulder, wearing a mushroom gown as white as snow, with tails unfurled and teeth sharpened. She asked what I would do without Hugo. I replied that I would study the weight and color of leaves as they fell, gathering them in piles to feel them crumble in my hands. Decomposition would set in, and the house would sit empty. As I imagined the collapse, my hands shook. The fox shed her mushroom gown and took on the look of death. Encouraging me to lift the rock, I did so, and Hugo's eyes showed realization and recognition. However, the fox was not here for me, she only guided my hand. Hugo held a cleaned oyster mushroom in his hand, aware of what was to come but uncaring. He smashed it in his fist, letting its flesh ooze between his fingers. With a menacing grin, he showed his sweet-toothed smile for the second time that day. I swung the rock down,